In a good procedure, you never see the tumor, right? Because it's kind of embedded in healthy tissue, but you don't want to cut out too much. And so, doing this robotically with a precision margin, I think has a huge potential impact on patients, on how surgeries are performed. So, really excited to further dig into this really important problem.
This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm Nate Potker. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and advanced robotics are dramatically transforming society, and healthcare is one of the areas where these technologies could solve many of the issues facing the field today. During surgery, patients depend on the speed, precision, and experience of their doctor. New AI-enhanced technologies are helping to ensure surgeons are well-trained, while also enhancing their abilities in the operating room. We're joined today by Axel Krieger, Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering at Johns Hopkins University, where his team focuses on the development of novel tools, imaging, and robot control techniques for medical robotics. Dr. Krieger, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to be talking a lot about robotics and surgical applications of them. Are people currently getting surgeries from robots?
Yeah, it's quite common to get surgery with robots. So current surgical robotic technology is completely teleoperated. So a surgeon sits on a console, seeing the scene in 3D, and then operating on a little controller. So like a joystick for surgical robots, and then the robot performs the surgery over the bedside. And the surgeon sits in the operating room at a console a few meters away from the patient. So this is quite common, done millions of times already. Right now maybe about 2% of all surgeries use robot assistance.
And that would be something like the Da Vinci robot. I think
exactly.
A lot of people have heard about.
The big market leader is Intuitive, the Da Vinci robot. That's definitely the most common surgical robotic technology out there on the market.
For a surgeon, what's the benefit of having a robot device involved in a surgery?
Yeah, the benefits are that it's a lot ergonomically easier to sit on a console than standing over the patient. These surgeries are done laparoscopically. That means that we don't have, traditional open access anymore to the organs, with, looking at the organs. You operate with these stick tools. So long, metal, tools, cameras inside the body. And with those tools to operate, it's quite difficult to do that manually. So the robot assistance allows you, easier manipulation. What it's really nice is that the robotic system aligns the view with the direction of the robotic tool movement. So if you move the controller to the right, it moves the tool to the right in the camera frame. That makes it a lot easier because that alignment, if you try to do that manually, is quite difficult. And if you operate through these stick tools, through laparoscopic incisions and ports, then everything is reversed because you have to pivot around these entry points. And so that movement is very difficult. So robot assistance has made minimally invasive surgery easier and has, a real, economic benefits for the surgeons.
A couple of years ago, you developed the Smart Tissue Autonomous Robot. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so we started this kind of at the time quite crazy idea that, we can do more autonomous functions, started the Smart Tissue Autonomous Robot, where we focus particularly on suturing, on anastomosis. So that's a closing of tubular structures. So imagine if you have a colon cancer, you take out, a piece of colon, then you have to reconnect it, right? And that reconnection step can have a lot of complications. And that's really what we dug into at first. That, suturing step, it's very repetitive. It's, need to place 15, 20 sutures. If you want to make one mistake, you have a potential leak. So that's, I think, where, autonomous robotic functions can really help. The robot doesn't get tired and has very repeatable. And so there we can, cut down on complications. The smart tissue autonomous robot was, what we call a model-based approach. So there was before, the, real big, improvements in learning-based methods. So there we have, separate perception. So finding the target in the, at the right organ to perform the anastomosis, finding the corners of the anastomosis setup. We use near-infrared trackers to help with that. Then, 3D tracking of the tissue target, and then modeling the interaction of the suturing tool with the target and building a very particular camera system and very special robotic tools for the suturing. So it was really a custom-made approach for all aspects of the suturing. So, tracking, cameras, and tools. And with that, we achieved really good, success rate for anastomosis and showed that we can, reduce the variance of how far apart stitches are. And that is a nice metric for good anastomosis.
Right. When it's precisely the same as opposed to like an eyeball that a person might do.
Exactly,
really
it's very difficult for a surgeon to consistently, place, let's say a 3 millimeter spacing between each sutures. But if that's programmed into the robot, much easier. And we really showed that we can improve the consistency of the distance between sutures.
What were some of the challenges developing that system? Like you mentioned a special camera system, the way we're training things now is a little different than the model-based system.
Right. So for our STAR robot to operate accurately, we need to really know the 3D position of all the target points for each suture. And so we need to first, find the anastomosis target. Then we need to track that, during the deformation and during movement, during breathing, in 3D. And so building that kind of perception tracking system to allows us to accurately map and track the tissue targets, that was a huge challenge and is quite difficult to achieve in this laparoscopic setting, right? We have really good, 3D cameras when we don't have, these restrictions to make them in a small little port, right? So that was the big, challenge for us.
How do you train, I guess, how do you tease apart the computer vision aspect to get it to be able to do that?
For the STAR robot, we actually built these small near-infrared markers. So these were, little super glue mixed with indocyanine green, so a fluorescent dye. And we can dab that at the corners of the anastomosis target. And with that, then, the corners of the anastomosis really light up like a Christmas tree. So it's really bright. And so then it's very easy for our robot to know where the corners of the target are. So we really helped by, building a very special marker that is biocompatible that, allowed us to, mark and then track the target area.
What is the SRTH framework?
Our latest work is the Hierarchical Surgical Robot Transformer, SRTH. And instead of using this model-based approach that we, employed for STAR, now we're using an end-to-end learning approach. And so the idea is that we don't need to build anymore a specialized, perception system, a 3D tracking system, that we really rely on expert surgeons to perform the procedure and create a neural network mapping between what the robot sees and what the robot should do. So this robot transformer, using transformer architecture, creates that mapping to, hey, if that's what I see in my target, this is where I go with my surgical robotic tool. The reason why we call it a hierarchical is because we have a hierarchy there. We have a high-level planner that recognizes the step of the surgical procedure, knows what part of the procedure needs to be performed, and then a low-level, architecture that then generates the right robot action to perform that task.
With this approach, what difference does that make for the performance of the robot?
What is really, striking is, that it's so general. So it's one framework, and you can learn different procedures just by adding new training data. So before, it was very, very specialized in suturing. We spent, a decade on kind of like, getting better and better at this. And now, within a year, we were able to kind of create this, transformer network, learn, cholecystectomy, so gallbladder operation. But with more data now, we showed that we can already, do other procedures. So that's kind of really nice. It's more a general approach. It's also what is great, that it's a lot of self-correcting abilities in there. So if you initially miss, for example, a little duct that you want to clip, the system recognizes the initial misplacement and then fixes itself. So there's self-correction and then generalizability are probably the two biggest huge advantages over the model-based star architecture that we employed before.
Have there been any challenges getting surgeons, for example, to offer to help or to demonstrate or to get involved with the project?
We have fantastic, surgeons here at Hopkins that are really excited about this. So that was not, a problem. Super supportive, and then also, making residents available that have a bit more time. They spend, a lot of time with us in the lab to learn the procedures. And then we were able to train, a really talented undergrad student, to, learn the procedure and then do, at scale the demonstrations that are necessary to, really train the SRTH framework.
You said that it took about a year to develop this part of it. What were the challenges kind of moving automated robots forward to getting that framework? And was it really just the approach to training that kind of leveled it up for you?
Certainly, building the architecture, that hierarchical framework, that, was a big effort because we wanted to really separate, the layer that recognized the right procedure. So we focused on gallbladder surgery. There's kind of a very important middle step there that we've been really honing in on. That is the clipping and cutting of the cystic duct and cystic artery. So that's a critical, fine manipulation step in the gallbladder surgery. So first we divided that procedure into 17 different subtasks, right? And those subtasks then trained a high-level, planner that looks at the video and knows which of the 17 steps are we currently performing and needs to be performed. And it also recognizes if something doesn't go well. So if we have a small misplacement, something is a little bit off, it raises a flag that we need to do some corrective actions. And so that was, really important architecture that allowed us then to use the surgical robot transformer to execute, the individual sub-steps and then, tie it all together to do such a long horizon, long procedure like gallbladder removal.
You mentioned in the training having it self-correct. How is it responding to anatomical variations?
We use an imitation learning framework. So it learns by, seeing different variations of the procedure and then applying it to the actual, procedure. And so that's a risk, right? That if it sees something that it has never seen before, then it really doesn't know what to do, right? So that's kind of the risk. And even in healthy pigs, so we procured, from a butcher, like these gallbladders on a liver bed. And so that's what we trained on and performed our tests on. And even in them, you see a lot of anatomical variations. So sometimes the duct and, and artery were, far apart, sometimes really close together, sometimes a lot of fat over it, sometimes not, sometimes more crossing at different angles. So we were able to, get about 30 different variations of that trained and then perform each of these 17 steps, repeatedly. So imagine like 10, 15, 20 times per procedural step per anatomical variation. And that then formed, about a 16, 17 hour long training data set that we trained on. And with that, then we were able to perform 8 consecutive gallbladder surgeries without needing any human intervention. So that was really the breakthrough of the level of autonomy there, that we really didn't need any human interactions during the execution. But, if we would now, try to perform the step on some variation of anatomy that wasn't in the training set, then we would run into problems and probably make mistakes and need human intervention.
But it shows how far it's come that it can do that many in a row and actually repeat it. Like the repeatability is so integral to getting this out into the world.
Absolutely. That's the big, major milestone that it achieved, 8 consecutive gallbladder surgery without any human interventions. So it's a real nice, step forward. And we're excited now to, take the next step and go towards, in vivo experiments.
So you mentioned that you are working with pig parts and working in labs. What is the path to getting this out into the world?
Yeah, for us, the big new step would be to, see if this technology can not just work on ex vivo samples, so from the butcher, parts of the gallbladder, but actually work in vivo setting. And so, our new big task now is to translate this work from, ex vivo samples to in vivo experiments. There we have, more breathing motion, we have a bit more bleeding, and, so that's the big challenge. And, the anatomy looks a bit different, there. So, that's going to be the big challenge for us to, get some more data, then augment, that data with our ex vivo set and perform, in vivo experiments and show that this is really a viable technology.
So I also want to ask you about your career award. What does NSF support mean to you?
The NSF Career Award was really foundational for my career. So I was lucky, before to have some, NIH funding. NIH funding is, very applied and, very disease specific. And so the Career Award was great because it really supports the underlying science. So I could really focus on that. So I don't think we would have, made it, to SRTH, without the, Career Award. And it's also such a big stamp of approval, from the NSF that helps with the, promotion and, getting, the tenure for me. So it was really kind of like, if I look back at my career, I got, 2022, the Career Award really took off after that. So I really credit, the NSF career for a lot of that success.
What are you excited to work on next yourself?
Yeah, I'm super excited about this translation to the in vivo side, right? So that's the big step that is, necessary for translation for us. I'm also really excited in other, surgical procedures that require, a lot of precision, particularly the tumor resection side. So we started working, a year ago on partial nephrectomy, so cutting out the kidney cancer under an SRTH award. So that's really exciting and very hard for surgeons to do, right? Surgeons see a preoperative scan and then create kind of this mental map where they need to cut and then try to, carve out that tumor precisely. And the tumor is often not even visible. You need to remove it with like a margin with healthy tissue. So in a good procedure, you never see the tumor, right? Because it's kind of embedded in healthy tissue, but you don't want to cut out too much. And so, doing this robotically with a precision margin, I think has a huge potential impact on patients, on how surgeries are performed. So, really excited to further dig into this really important problem.
For my last question here, I want to think about the future a little bit. Do you see, or how long do you think it might take surgical robots being ubiquitous, being the standard?
Definitely, we see, a large growth in the surgical robotics, market. I think about 18%, annual growth. And so, what started more in the urology market, for prostatectomy has now gone to, hysterectomy and now to a lot of different organ and different specialties. So we see the proliferation of that technology already. For kind of autonomous functions, we see this to be similar to, modern cars where, like we still, have a steering wheel, most of us really drive ourselves still, but we have some, functions that make driving just easier and more, enjoyable and less tiring, like lane assist, park assist, brake assist. And so those autonomous functions we think will come, in the next few years in surgical robotics. The FDA just approved, a function for camera following. So in surgery that the camera kind of can look around and follow the tools. So that's kind of a nice, first step of an autonomous function there. And so we see maybe, there could be section, could be resection, could be maybe then a suturing function. And so that is coming out over the next few years.
Special thanks to Axel Krieger. For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Potker. Please subscribe wherever you get podcasts. And if you like our program, share with a friend and consider leaving a review. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.